This episode of Amateur Traveler is sponsored by the Florida Keys Traveler podcast, by Factor, America's #1 ready-to-eat meal kit, and by Prismatext that makes learning a language as easy as reading a book. Amateur Traveler, episode 854. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about monasteries and mountains, a caravanserai, and the oldest cathedral, wine and waterfalls, as we do a road trip through the country of Armenia. This is Chris Christensen from Amateur Traveler. Let's talk about Armenia. I'd like to welcome back to the show John McKenzie, John from John the Curious Traveler on Instagram, or johnthetraveler.com on the web. And John, I say welcome back. He was here for episode 675 on the Kansas road trip, and he's come to talk to us about a different road trip. But Dorothy, we are not in Kansas anymore. John, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Chris. Great to be here again.
Sorry, I had that joke was just sitting there. I had to do that.
No worries.
And if you haven't listened to the episode on Kansas road trip, I literally just brought it up to my wife yesterday. I was telling John as we started recording, talking about the world's largest museum of small versions of large things. So that was a fun show. We're not talking about Kansas, so where are we talking about, John?
We are talking about Armenia,
which is somewhat east of Kansas.
Just a little bit. Yeah, pretty much on the other side of the world from all of North America, really. The Caucasus region.
So we're east of Turkey and west of the Caspian Sea here in Armenia.
Yeah, east and technically a little bit north. Armenia is wedged there between Turkey, Georgia, the country, and Azerbaijan, and
Excellent.
Iran a little bit.
And what's your connection with Armenia?
So I went there in October of 2022 as an attendee at the Extraordinary Travel Festival, and I love to travel, so I thought, I've never been here. I actually had planned to go in 2008, and it didn't happen, so I decided to stay and explore a little bit.
Excellent. And that's a festival that was put on by Rick Gazarian, who has also been a guest on Amateur Traveler years ago. And why should someone go to Armenia?
Armenia is full of lots of surprises, and it's really not that well known to a lot of people, especially in North America, unless they have a connection to Armenia. A lot of people ask me, are you Armenian? No, I'm just traveling. But Armenia has a lot of history and a lot of interesting things to see.
I think an Armenian name usually IAN at the end instead of a Mick at the beginning, but
Exactly. Almost every name ends in IAN or something.
And what kind of itinerary are you going to recommend for us in Armenia?
What I did is rented a car, and so I'm going to follow a little bit about the kind of route that I did and maybe add on something that I wish I could have done. As I started researching Armenia, I just kept finding more things that I really wanted to do. And even though I was there for a little bit longer than I think a lot of people might spend there, I didn't get to see everything. And when do you get to see everything? But I really found a lot of interesting things there to explore. So we're going to do a little road trip. And I know you've had a previous guest talk about Yerevan in particular, but Yerevan deserves another mention. That's the logical place that anyone will need to start if they go to Armenia anyway.
And this is the capital city where most of the international flights are going to go to and from.
Exactly, yes. And that's where I flew in. There's no direct flights that I'm aware of from, at least not from the east coast of the U.S. So I flew in, I had a layover in Brussels and got in at 2 in the morning. But Yerevan is a very nice, decent-sized city. It's very compact, very easy to travel around. That was one thing that really surprised me, especially given that the country of Armenia has their own language, but the language has its own alphabet. And I thought it would be really hard to understand, but almost all the signs had an English or at least a Latin script equivalent. And a lot of people spoke English, and at least in Yerevan. And it was very easy to navigate the city. It's very walkable. And I ended up staying downtown. And I should mention the place that I stayed, I was trying to just to save a few bucks, and I found a hostel called the Kantar Hostel. It was located right downtown, and they had one of the best breakfast spreads that I've ever had in any place I've stayed, including some nicer hotels. So while I may have saved a lot of money on the staying in a dorm room, I really enjoy that breakfast. But the food in Armenia is also really good, so it was good to have a mixture of local food and some other familiar things there.
Got it. And what do you recommend that we see when we're in Yerevan?
So I would say one of the first stops really should be the Armenian Genocide Memorial.
Okay.
So this is on a hill. You probably need to take the equivalent of an Uber. They have their own version of that there. And you can get up there. I think there might be a bus, but I actually walked, but it's up on the top of a hill. So it has a really nice view of the city as well as Mount Ararat. But it's obviously a somber memorial to document the Armenian population that was massacred by the Ottoman Empire. And it actually goes into quite extensive history and details, so it's really good to spend some time there. And then just also while you're there to check out the views from up there, I would allot at least a couple hours for that. There are several history museums in the city. I think just given the fact that what I'd like to focus on is more the countryside. And so I'm not going to really go into details about museums just because there's the History Museum of the country, which I didn't actually get to, but there are some other museums in the city that might be worth checking out. But like I said, I'm not going to focus on that because I really want to get out into the countryside, which I think is where Armenia shows its best. But Yerevan, it's very compact. The center part of Yerevan, it's called the Kentron, and it has a ring road around it, and then everything inside is pretty much what you want to see. So it's very walkable, very easy to get to. The other couple stops that I would suggest in Yerevan would be Charles Aznavour Square. I had never heard of him before, but apparently he is a French musician that has ties to Armenia. But they have a beautiful square that has this really interesting statue of a spider that's made out of car parts. It's really cool to see. It's unique. It's next to a fountain that has the zodiac symbols. There's a cinema and theater there. So it's just a nice, pretty thing to look at on the way to walk around. The other big thing that I would say most people want to see when they're in Yerevan is called the Cascade, which is also an art museum. So it's steps that go from that main part of Yerevan up to a hill that overlooks the city. And inside, between the steps, there's a building that you can go in, and there's different art galleries. And then even outside, there's lots of public art. And you can walk up the steps, which is what I did, and then each time you go up to another level, there's a fountain with different gardens. And you turn around and you can look back behind you and see the city and just get vantage points each time you go up. And it's just very pretty, especially if the weather is clear and you can see Mount Ararat clearly in the distance.
And this is the second time you brought up Mount Ararat, which is very central to the Armenian national identity, yet not in Armenia.
Yes, and you'll probably hear me talk about Mount Ararat quite a bit because it really is everywhere. Historical Armenia did include Mount Ararat, which is why I think everyone in Armenia really looks to Mount Ararat as the national symbol. But you're right, it's in Turkey. But you can see it from a lot of points in southern Armenia. And I would say in Yerevan is probably, and a few other places that I'll mention, you can see it very clearly. And it's an iconic mountain and pretty. There's also a little Ararat that's next to it that I didn't even hear of growing up. But it's often more clear, at least it was when I was looking at it. But they're right next to each other.
Got it. Okay.
Yes. So if you have extra time, if you go up the Cascade steps and make it all the way to the top, you can keep going up the hill to Victory Park. And along Victory Park at the end of that is a huge statue that they call Mother Armenia. It was one of during the Soviet Union, it has that Soviet architectural style, but they transitioned it to a Armenian museum now, a small museum. But it's the statue, it's this grand, imposing statue that's overlooking the city. So if you're really interested in Soviet architecture and those types of imposing statues, then you'll enjoy Yerevan and Armenia.
My understanding was that didn't used to be Mother Armenia. It used to be Joseph Stalin at the top of that big pedestal.
Yeah, there are quite a few former monuments that they transitioned to make them Armenian. There was another one right at the top of the hill. There's another one at the end of Victory Park that's the Mother Armenia, but the one at the top of the cascade, I think, was some war monument. I'll have to look that up because I'm not sure the exact title. It was long, but they left that there as well. But yeah.
Okay.
A few other places to note if there's time, because again, walking through Yerevan, you can go in different directions. There is an old Armenian Apostolic Church that was built in 1264. A lot of it was damaged in the earthquake, but it is worth a visit. Now, I'm not going to pronounce this correct, but it's Katohike. There are quite a few churches in Yerevan, but most of the monasteries and churches that I'll mention will probably be in the countryside, but that one is specifically historic there. And at night, and any time of the day, but especially at night, I really liked Republic Square. So that is the main center of the city where all the government buildings, that's where the History Museum is, the National Gallery, there's a Marriott Hotel, and then there's a few other buildings, but they light them up at night. And what's particularly interesting about not just these buildings, but almost every monastery and church in Armenia is they're made of a particular substance that we call tufa, I believe is the pronunciation. So its origin is volcanic, and it's a ubiquitous thing in Armenia. And even in Armenian churches in other countries, they may use this substance. But in Armenia, you'll see it everywhere. And so at night, they have these buildings lit up. There's fountains. It's just very pretty to see.
Okay.
And now I was there in October, but I did hear and read about a celebration that happens in July called Vardavar. And that is where everybody just goes around spraying each other with water. Probably because it's very hot in July. But if you do go in the summer, beware that A, it's very hot, and B, you might get wet. And that might be a good thing. But I thought that would be interesting to note. I will then go ahead, if it's okay, to just kind of go out of the city now, just because there are so many things to see here. So I would say on a kind of a second day, you could have an option of doing one of the most popular day trips from Yerevan. And if you're going to rent a car for a week, you could include this in your drive, or you could do a day trip with a tour company or hire a vehicle or something like that, because it's very close. There's two sites pretty close to each other. One is called Garni, and so Garni is a pagan temple from the 1st century AD that was damaged in an earthquake, but not enough to be demolished. They actually have a rule in Armenia that a certain percentage, and I can't remember what it was, but a certain percentage of the building, if it wasn't damaged, then they're allowed to rebuild the remaining part to keep it intact. And so Garni is, I think it's the only pagan temple left from that time, because Christianity became the state religion in 301 AD, and I believe Armenia was the first country to become a Christian country. A lot of the temples that weren't Christian, of course, they tore them down. But this one remained, and right adjacent to it in the canyon is a rock formation that's really interesting, and I think they call it the Symphony of Stones. So when you're there, you can see both of those things. And nearby is a UNESCO monastery called Gegard, and it's from between the 4th and 13th century. It had a series of construction. So those two make really good day trip sites.
Got it.
And if you take a tour, like from a bus tour, that's probably going to be the full day. But if you have your own car, you could probably make it back to Yerevan and see some of the other things. I didn't get to see it, but Erebuni is the original fortress remnants that predate Yerevan from 782 BC. And another option that might take a little bit longer, but if you have your own car, it'll take quicker, is Echmiadzin. So that's west of Yerevan. And that is the location of the Armenian Apostolic Church. So it's basically like the Vatican City of Armenia, if you will. And in that city, which is also known as Vagar-Shapat, there are three UNESCO, they group them all together, the Echmiadzin campus and the three UNESCO churches, Guyana, Hripsime, and Shogakat. So those are three things that you can check out there. All of them made from the tufa and all from, I believe, the 7th century. And
one question I have so far, you mentioned a couple times now that survived the earthquake. And I didn't know if you were talking about the 1988 earthquake, which is the last big one I know of there. I imagine there have been more than one over the 2,000 years that Armenia's been around, 2,000
yes,
plus.
Good point. Yes, there were actually quite a few earthquakes over the course of history. The one that I remember and wrote down was the Katahike Church in Yerevan. That was from 1679. And the Garni earthquake may have been from that same time frame.
Okay.
I'm not 100% sure, but I know that there was a fairly large earthquake in the 1600s, probably that one, that damaged quite a bit in the country.
Okay.
But the 1988 one did a significant amount of damage to the city of Gyumri. And I will mention that later as an option if people have more time and want to explore more of Armenia. But yeah, no, that's a good point. They are earthquake prone. So I'll go on to the next day. So let's just say at this point you have your own car and you're ready for that full-on road trip. So then you'll leave Yerevan and go to the Korvarop Monastery. So this is a monastery that's probably one of the most popular pilgrimage sites in the country. It dates back to 642 in its earliest form, and it's got various levels of reconstruction and adding on and so forth. But that is another location where the views of Mount Ararat are amazing, especially on a clear day. And I would say that might be one of the most iconic because you don't have to worry about being in the city and all of the city noise and sights. You could just get that clear view of the Ararat with the monastery in the background if you go to a certain location. That's worth a stop on your way east. And so I'm taking us to the southeastern part of the country, the Siunik province, because it's this little arm of Armenia that sticks down between a part of Azerbaijan called Nakhichevan and then the rest of mainland Azerbaijan. Maybe just because it's a little bit further away, people don't get out there too much. You can technically do a very full day trip and go to some of the sites there, but really the gold is in the rural areas that you really need a little bit more time.
Okay.
And then again, this drive passes through, and we're going to go back through the same area a little bit. So you could either do this on the way or on the way back, the next couple things that I'm going to mention.
If I say key lime pie, dry tortugas, and the African Queen, and you don't immediately get excited about traveling down to the Florida Keys, then I think the new Florida Keys Traveler podcast series is for you. It celebrates the 200th anniversary of the founding of the Florida Keys, so there's no better time than now to learn and dream about this chain of islands that begins just south of Miami and stretches some 125 miles between the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico. But this show explores more than just travel. There's history, sports fishing, diving, dolphins, turtles, writers, artists, music, and cuisine, including, of course, key lime pie. Each episode of Florida Keys Traveler features at least one Keys resident who reveals a new side to the Conch Republic, such as kayaking to a ghost town on a remote island, meeting the man who wants 1,000,000 grandchildren beneath the sea, discovering treasure, the influences of Bahamian, African American, and Cuban cultures, and literary greats such as Ernest Hemingway and Tennessee Williams. Listen wherever you get your shows, or head to fla-keys.com to find out more and listen there. Links and information are in the show notes and the website too, Florida Keys Traveler Podcast. Subscribe and listen today. And thanks to the Florida Keys Traveler Podcast for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
So, on your way to Goris, which is the capital, or one of the major cities at least, of Scenic Province, you will pass through Arani. Arani is in the wine region, and it is unique because not only does it have several wineries, it has a cave that's known for two things that are a little bit interesting. One is they found the oldest shoe. They only found one, but it was 5,500 years old. And they also found in the same cave evidence of the oldest winery, which from about 4,100 BC, I believe. And yeah, these things were discovered really not that long ago. I think 2008 to 2011 are when they were excavating that. It makes you wonder if there's more, because there are quite a few caves in Armenia that probably aren't even discovered. You even pass some just driving on the highway.
And one would also wonder if it's associated with domestication of dogs, because how else did they lose that shoe? You have to really wonder.
Exactly. Yeah, Arani has this cave, and then the wineries. It's a pleasant area. They're right down a small road from Arani is, again, one of Armenia's more well-known monasteries. It's called Noravank, and it's on the side of a hill overlooking this valley. Very pretty. It's a 13th century monastery. There's a lot of different ornate facades on the side, and it's in a beautiful gorge there. And I really think between those two, that's just a very good stop. Either I would suggest on the way, because then you have a few more hours to get to Goris.
Okay.
And Goris is a really good base for some of the sites in the area. But I found the city very pleasant. There's a few things in the city itself, but really it's a better just to have as a base. It's in a valley, not too far from Azerbaijan and the Nagorno-Karabakh area, which is a bit disputed, but you wouldn't know that if you were in Goris.
Because bit disputed.
Yeah, to put it mildly. And actually, when I was there in October, they had just had significant resurgence of the fighting on both sides, and both sides were blaming each other, and it can get really complicated to try to engage and try to find out the details there, but at the same time, I didn't feel unsafe. There was no real evidence of anything going on other than, and this might be a big one, but I did see a few Russian tanks pass by. But in the city, everything is going fairly peacefully, and everyone's just living their life, and people are very friendly, very generous in Goris. I would recommend that as a good stopping point to, like I said, to base yourself, because it's a bit larger than some of the other cities. An alternative would be Sisian, and that's actually where I ended up staying because I couch surfed for a few days there in a very rural setting with no internet. That may not be to everyone's liking, but I had a good time there. But Goris is probably a better base.
And the other thing you didn't mention about Goris is, if I had to say that it looks like some other place, I would say it looks like Cappadocia in Turkey, with the same kind of spires, hoodoos.
Yeah, so one thing I was going to say, for probably that day, by the time you get to Goris, it might be enough of a day, but another full day, I would suggest to go to these caves And I unfortunately couldn't make it there because of the weather. Between the weather and me feeling under the weather, I didn't get to go to Khndzorsk. Might have to spell that. Khndzorsk. That is one of these old cave cities, and I believe also has a swinging bridge that goes over these hoodoos. And it used to be one of the largest cities in the 19th century, but it was devastated in 1931 by another earthquake. And there are other caves in the area too that might be worth exploring. And I know that there's a company called Hike Armenia that really has a number of different organized hikes that you can take for, I think there's one that's about an hour and a half that goes to these caves, because they're not necessarily super easy to get to if you don't know the territory, of course. So I might recommend checking that out if you're really into hiking.
And when you say caves, I get the impression you're talking about troglodytes, if you will, people who lived in caves rather than going to Carlsbad Caverns or something and see more natural caves.
You're right. And I should mention that because even in neighboring Georgia, too, there were some cave cities where people lived. And I think even up into relatively recent times, there were people still living in some of the caves. That is one thing that I wish I had been able to do. One of the biggest things to see there, and it's a little bit pricey, but I really think it's worth it because of the views, is the world's longest nonstop reversible cable car. Yes, lots of words there, but basically it's a 12-minute ride in a cable car that goes over this really long gorge from the station at Haladzor over to Tatev. And once you get to Tatev, it's a small town, but there's a monastery that overlooks that same gorge that you just went over. So it offers beautiful views, lots of history, and there are also a lot of different hiking opportunities in that area. And when you go over...
And when you say the world's largest non-reversible, reversible... This is an aerial tramway when you say cable car.
Yes, aerial tramway, yes.
Okay.
So you go over it, they have a recording to tell you about the sites that you're seeing, because at one point you go over a ruins of a convent, I believe, and then the Devil's Bridge and a very jagged road that looks like it would be very difficult to drive on. So they have a narration going on in, I believe, English, Armenian, and Russian. And they continue going through as you go over. And then you can ride it back, or if you happen to find a way to get back to where you were. I drove to the station, so I had to get a round trip. But the monastery is definitely worth checking out, too. And so that probably will take much of that day. But the rural areas around there, if you do have extra time, there's always just taking a little road and driving around and looking at the countryside, because that's really what Armenia has a lot to offer. Those unusual views of turning a corner and seeing this mountainscape in juxtaposition with the rock, and it always catches you by surprise. So that was probably one of my favorite things, to just never knew when you went around a curve what you were going to see.
Interesting. And you had mentioned a couple times, you mentioned independence and you mentioned narration in Russian tanks. One thing that people may have forgotten, it possibly happened during most of our listeners' lifetime, but might have been earlier on in your lifetime, was that they haven't been independent from the Soviet Union for all that long. That was 1991 when they declared their independence as the Soviet Union was breaking up there after the fall of the Berlin Wall. That's why Joseph Stalin used to be on the statue. That's why you see tanks that are of Russian design. That's why we get Russian narration. Is it's not been all that long an independent country, and that's true of all of the countries down here in the southern Caucasus.
And right, again, at the time that I was going there, and there's always been a large Russian population in the major cities, but it just happened that there was a larger influx of Russian people coming into all of these countries to escape
Because of
the
the war,
Russian war. Yeah. I've talked to several young Russian people that were just looking for a place to stay and a way to work remotely so that they could get out of the country. So it was a very interesting time to be there. But in Armenia, I have a very limited Russian working knowledge, so it came in a little handy, at least in a few places. That might, if anybody has any Russian knowledge, that might help. But pretty much everything was in the Latin script as a secondary on the signs and in menus and things like that.
Interesting. This episode of Amateur Traveler is sponsored by Factor. Now that it's summer, you might be looking for wholesome, convenient meals for sunny, active days. Factor, America's #1 ready-to-eat meal kit, can help you fuel up fast with flavorful and nutritious ready-to-eat meals delivered straight to your door. Just take a Factor meal, pop it in the microwave, and it's ready to eat in 2 minutes. Never frozen. Some of my favorites of the ones I've tried so far are the jalapeno lime cheddar chicken and also the spicy and sweet potatoes and peanut sauce. The second one had 660 calories per serving, but they also have calorie smart meals with around or less than 550 calories per serving. Whether you're looking for keto or vegan or veggie or protein plus, there are options on the menu each week to fit your lifestyle. This June, get Factor and enjoy eating well without the hassle. Simply choose your meals and enjoy fresh, flavor-packed meals delivered to your door, ready in just 2 minutes, no prep, no mess. Head to factormeals.com/traveler50 and use code traveler50 to get 50% off your first box. That's code traveler50 at factormeals.com/traveler50 to get 50% off your first box. And thanks to Factor for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
But yeah, so day 5, I think we're on. It's probably my favorite. This is the day that it's because I tend to really like to get off the beaten track and then off of that beaten track too.
Okay, I was already loving it.
But I think it just happened. I was a little sick and I didn't want to go as far, do as much driving further away from where I was staying. So I thought, well, let me just take one of these close by roads. Well, that turned out to be worth it because, and I found out later that even in my room that I didn't even know, there was a little brochure about some of these sites. But from Sisian, which again, you can take this same route from Goris and go along the Voratan Valley. The Voratan is a river that runs in that area. And it goes through a number of small but interesting sites. So from Goris, you would start and you would go to a place called Voratnavank. And so Vank is a suffix that tends to mean fortress, or at least I noticed that most of the fortresses end with that suffix.
Okay.
And so Voratan being the river, so Voratnavank makes sense. It's a beautiful, very old, it didn't look very used, I would say, but there was some presence of people going there, but it wasn't like it was some of the other ones where people were clearly going there all the time, maybe just because it was more rural. But that's what made it really special, because you felt like you had the whole place to yourself, which I literally did. And inside there are some frescoes that were from, I want to say it's the 11th century, and they look a little worn. They are a little old, but you go in and you see that, and then you can look over the valley and the views and the atmospheric quality of being there with seeing that and the stones is just breathtaking. And just around the bend from there is a small town called Voratan. They used to have hot springs. The hot springs are still there. There's not a sanatorium, which was a popular hotel-like establishment that during the Soviet Union, a lot of people would go to the sanatorium and stay, and they were always around these hot springs. But This looks like that either didn't ever happen or was abandoned. But there were hot springs. And then right around the corner from that town was a bridge called the Melik Tangi Bridge. And this bridge goes over the river, really small, but I learned that the bridge was a historical crossing for trade from Persia up through the Caucasus region. And as soon as you cross that bridge, there's another one of these rock formations that, like I mentioned earlier, the symphony of stones.
Basalt columns.
Yes, basalt columns.
We didn't say that when you mentioned it before.
Yes, all of this volcanic related rock. So I didn't know about all of these things when I was just driving around. So it caught me all by surprise, and they're all right there. And that same column of basalt that you see, on top of it is an old fortress called Voratnabird. So you can climb up there to the top, which I did. It was a little bit steep, and I was a little bit out of shape, but it was a beautiful view. You can see all of these things from there as well. In Sisian, there is a place, has a couple different names. Karahunj is probably one of the most well-known names, but I prefer Zorat's Karer just because there's other names in the country that are called Karahunj. But Zorat's Karer is probably from, I want to say it's 7,000 BC. Correct me if I'm wrong there, but it is the Stonehenge of Armenia. That's one description that they have used to talk about it. And it's these circular path of stones that have carvings in the top. So there's a couple times in the day that the light will go through them. Unfortunately, when I was there, there were clouds, so I didn't get to see. But if you're there at certain times of the day or of the year, the light will come through and shine a certain way. They designed it that way back then. Very interesting stones. Maybe they don't know everything about them, but it's an interesting stop on your way in that area. In the Sisian area, there's also a waterfall called Shaki. So this whole route that I'm describing could be a good way to leave Goris and continue on the road trip west, back through a couple of the places that if you didn't get there the first time, you can go again. Okay. Or just go again because you liked it. But I would recommend going on to a town called Yaghnazor, and that's only because it is a good stopping point before you continue on north. And it's also in the wine region. There is a restaurant there called the Old Bridge Winery. It's a little pricey, but they have a long winemaking tradition, and stop and try some wine and just stay the night and then get up the next morning and go. Also,
when you say something is expensive, before we started recording, you told me you were a budget traveler. So are we expensive for an American, expensive for an Armenian, expensive for a budget traveler?
Good point. And I didn't get there because you did need reservations. I remembered $30 for the cheapest thing is what somebody had told me.
$30 for a main course.
Yeah,
okay.
Which in Armenia, that is quite pricey. Armenia is not very expensive overall. You can get some pretty good food for a lot less than that. I would say probably your typical dinner for two, which would be tasting the wines, probably could run up to $100 or over $100. So that's what I meant by expensive there, because that's a bit high for Armenia too. But there are other wineries or places where you can get wine. Armenia is known for its brandy. It's Ararat brandy, so there's that. Yeah, so another place that's possibly, if you're more interested in the spa or hot springs, I believe it is, Jermuk. I didn't go there, but it could be a stop along the way from Sisian and Goris onto the Yaghnazor. But there's a waterfall, and it has some spa things. I think there's a small tourist presence there. Not when I say tourist presence, none of these places have a large amount of tourists, but it's known for some people stop there. But so those are some options for that day. But the next day after that, I would say we'd head north-ish to Lake Sevan. And here is where we could I'll go through the road trip part of it. So as you leave that Yegnazor, you're going to go over Salim Pass, which has a caravanserai, a place on the top, and it's a pass, so it's a mountain pass. It's an old stone caravanserai where they would stop and meet, and they called it the Orbilian. I'm not sure what that means, but when I went, it happened to be extremely foggy. I almost got stuck in the mud, but it made it really special because when I went inside, because of the way the clouds and the fog were, really, you just felt the presence of history there. It was really, again, to use the word atmospheric.
And the answer to your question is the reason it's Orbilian is it was built by Prince Orbilian in 1332 to accommodate weary travelers.
There you go. It was really the only thing between, once I left the area, before getting to the next town on Lake Sevan. There aren't many stops in between, and I would imagine that would be a necessary stop. But it was very good that there's a little pull off, and if it's not raining, then you won't have to worry about the mud. And I would imagine there'd be amazing views of the countryside around.
And Lake Sevan being the largest body of water in the country and being something like a fifth the length of the country.
Yes, it's definitely, looking at any map, it's a big chunk of the country. And it's big. I wanted to drive around the lake, but as you said, it's quite big. And a lot of the sites that are interesting are really on the west shore or the west side of it. Mm-hmm. So I focused on just stopping along there, going north to Dilijan.
This episode of Amateur Traveler is sponsored by Prisma Text. You want to learn a foreign language because you know it will make your travel better, but it's too hard. Prisma Text gives you a different way to effortlessly learn a language. You read a story, you learn a language. When you go to prismatext.com, you can download a book and then choose how many of the words in the book are translated into the language you're trying to learn. So as you're reading, say, Agatha Christie, you get more and more Spanish words included in until you find yourself learning Spanish without even thinking about it. They have more than 400 different vocabulary words per book, and Prismatext has found that it's 50% more effective than traditional language acquisition methods. You can choose from one of 16 different languages. Want to learn French while reading biographies or maybe German with your favorite sci-fi book? It's up to you. Instead of setting aside time to study a language, instead you can practice just by doing what you want to do, reading your favorite book. To learn more, visit prismatext.com and select from hundreds of titles to start learning a language from your favorite stories. To save 20% off your first order, you can use the code AMATEUR, AMATEUR. And thanks to Prismatext for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
So if you're going that way, so the first stop is going to be Noratus. Noratus is known for having the largest collection of kachkars. And a kachkar is a cross, it's stonework. I would say another thing that's unique to Armenia is there are crosses that are made of stone that are everywhere. They're statues, or in this case, cemetery headstones. But you'll see the crosswork, and they're very intricate. Each one's a little bit different. Anyone who creates them, I think they try to make a signature look because they're all different. But Noratus Cemetery has the largest collection. I can't remember the years, but they're quite old. And so some of them look a little bit, they look old, right?
Dating back to the 900s.
900s, okay. It's also a modern cemetery, too. There are people that have more traditionally modern headstones, but there's a collection of the cemetery that you can go around and see some of those historic ones. And there are some people there, I think some old ladies that might try to give you a tour if you're unwittingly just going to go along. And if you speak Russian, I suppose you could get a tour from them that explains the different tombstones. But there are some plaques at the entrance that tell some of the notable stones. But that's an interesting stop on your way north along the lake. There are 2 noteworthy monasteries. One I didn't remember seeing in any guidebook, but it's called Hyravank. And there was a sign on the road, so I just pulled over. And it was just a beautiful monastery overlooking the lake, but not as big as the more well-known Savanavank, which is going to be next. But I just happened to see the sunlight was hitting through the window at a way that the light was coming through, that ray of light almost looked tangible. I've never seen anything quite photogenic, I guess I could say, in terms of that. I can't guarantee that's going to happen every time, but it certainly was a memorable stop for me. Savanavank is probably the most popular monastery on the lake because it's on a hill overlooking a beautiful part of the lake. It's not too terribly far from Yerevan, coming from a different direction, so a lot of families will go up there, they'll visit the monastery, they'll go to a resort around the lake and maybe spend the weekend. So when I went there, every place else I had been was pretty quiet. And this was one exception. It was a lot busier. It was quite a change from what I had been used to. But it's worth seeing because it's definitely got a good view right there on the lake. Like I mentioned, there are some resorts, so if you wanted to just have a relaxing lakeside holiday, you certainly could do that. But I'm going to continue the road trip on to Dilijan, which is just a little bit more north of the lake. And Dilijan is a mountain town surrounded by the Dilijan National Park. So this is a chance, again, if you are into hiking, if you really like outdoors, you may want to spend a little bit more time in this area because there are a lot of different hiking and outdoor activities in that area. I'll just mention a couple things because this is where we're approaching the end of our week and you could go one way or another or extend it, which of course I would always recommend. But your last day could either be continuing here, adding a day to go on to the Hagartsen Monastery and do a hike in the national park. You could do a day trip to the city of Ichiban, or you could leave Dilijan and continue north from Vanadzor along the Debed Valley. This would probably be a pretty full day, so you'd want to get up pretty early because if you're returning the rental car that night, you're going to want to allot enough time to get back to Yerevan and beat traffic. But the Debed Valley has a number of historic monasteries, including a few UNESCO World Heritage sites and I'll just mention a couple of the names that are either monasteries or churches that are known for having maybe some paintings or frescoes. So there's Aktala, Hagapat, Sanahin, as I mentioned. Alaverdi is a city, and it's on a very tall plateau that overlooks the river. And then there's a couple small towns that if you had time, you could drive through to Manyan Seg. Cannot pronounce that. And then there's some canyons. But that's probably going to take much of that day, so you're going to want to start heading back from Vanadzor south on to Yerevan. Now, I can't help but add a little other option, just again in case, because what I ended up doing was from Vanadzor, I went south on a loop. There's a few different ways you can get back to Yerevan. One goes just a little west of Vanadzor to Spitak and then south along, I think it's the M3 highway. And one quirky attraction there that I just really like quirky attractions, so I had to stop here. It is the Armenian alphabet monument. And yes, the Armenian alphabet has unique characters, and I think there are
39 different characters in the Armenian alphabet.
Yes. I know that some are newer, some are older, but someone decided to build a monument, and each letter gets its own statue. So they're spread out over this area, and there were a lot of people there taking selfies, perhaps next to their initials or something like that. It was just one of those quirky things that was worth seeing. But one thing that was an added bonus was on that drive, you also get to see Armenia's actual highest point, which is Mount Aragats. So that's in the borders of Armenia. And you can also go up there. There's an observatory. There's a few things to see up there, but I think you need a tour. If you want to climb the mountain, that's a whole other story, but you can see really good views of it from the highway. You can easily just pull over and get a couple really good shots if the weather is cooperating.
And in October, was it still snow-capped, or had all the snow melted by that point?
No, there was still snow. Yeah, and the weather was really nice in October. It was getting a little cooler, but it wasn't really what I would call cold. In the Syunik province in Sisian, there were a few nights that it got a little chilly, and then on the pass, I didn't mention that you go across. It's a little bit of a pass, and nothing like the one that I mentioned with the caravanserai, but there is a pass that, for me, it was, when I went past it, it was snowing. So I got to see snow and drive through that as well. It was short-lived because as soon as I left that, it happens to be on the border of two provinces. 2 minutes later, it was sunny and beautiful. The weather can change quite fast in that area.
Got it.
But yeah, the mountaintops were gorgeous in October with lots of snow. And
I see that it's over 13,000 feet, I think is what I was seeing.
Yeah, no, it's pretty tall. And Ararat is a lot further away, I think. Might be able to see both of them. I'll have to look at some of my pictures again.
Yeah, Ararat is over 16,000, so that's the one I was thinking.
Ararat did have a few. It was hard to see sometimes because it was a little hazy. Again, being in the city, and sometimes also just from dust or burning of crops and things like that.
Sure.
A couple other honorable mentions of sites, again, on the way, if you pick and choose different things that if you pass by that Armenian alphabet monument, there are, on the same highway, there are a couple more monasteries worth mentioning. There's Sagmosavank and Hovhanavank. And then there is I believe they might call it a cathedral in Mugni. They actually were having a wedding, so I wasn't able to go inside. But these are just notable things that are one after the other make a good little road trip there. So I would say that's probably as much for a week. You'll have to leave some of those things out, but I wanted to provide a few options just in case people had extra time for adding on a few days. I will say, as just a caution for returning a rental car, by the way, I used Swift, and I did a lot of research on rental cars because for me, this was the first time I had ever rented a car in another country by myself and drove around. And I found it to be a lot easier than I thought. It was actually quite fun. There are a few things to be aware of. You don't want to drive at night. There are some roads that are a little questionable, especially the rural areas, but the highways are pretty straightforward. Some of the truck traffic can be slow, and so they'll slow meaning like they might be going 5 to 10 miles an hour. And so you have to pass them, and a lot of the people just pass with, the center lines mean very little. But for me, if I could see, I was going to pass. At least I got to a comfortable place of doing that. But if I couldn't see ahead, I wasn't going to try. But I had no problems. But I would suggest getting back at least 2 hours to get back into Yerevan, just because the traffic, there was construction on some of the roads, and also finding a gas station because you have to fill the car up. That was a bit stressful because there aren't many gas stations inside of the city of Yerevan. So you want to make sure that you map that out before you go. When the last chance to fill up your car is. I will mention one more place, and then just in case people want to get a different taste of a different part of the country, Gyumri, which I mentioned earlier, that had that big earthquake in 1988,
Right.
which actually, unfortunately, killed half of the population of the city
Oh, my.
at the time. They're still recovering from it, but it's an interesting place. You can see evidence that it hasn't completely recovered. I did go on quite a walk to go see this thing called the Iron Fountain, and it's pretty much what it sounds like. It is an old Soviet Union relic. It was a huge fountain that is no longer flowing water. It's just this big monstrosity in the northern suburb. But everything around it is abandoned. But it's this big, strange looking Soviet architectural...
That looks like it just landed there from outer space.
It does. It really does look like something from outer space. And so, again, if you're a fan of Soviet architecture, which apparently I am, you will go out of your way to go see that. There is a very large church in kind of the center of the town that is being rebuilt. From the outside, it's rebuilt, but it was originally destroyed by that earthquake. But they're still doing the interior. But the outside is rebuilt, so it's pretty. And they have some original structure that was part of the original church next to it, and then some historical information about the earthquake. And it's a pleasant enough city, the town square. But for me, I took the train to get there. So they do have a train network. It's limited. It doesn't go to too many places in the country, but I think it was about 3 hours from Yerevan to Gyumri, and it cost about $3. So very comfortable.
Yeah.
You see some of the countryside, so if that's an option too. But yeah, and that was just a smattering of places. There are a lot of rural, even more off the beaten track monasteries are hidden all around the country. I didn't mention that the people were super friendly. Everywhere I went, people were just happy that you were there to see their country, and I had nothing but good things to say about Armenia. I think it's really underrated. People just don't know that much about it. It's very affordable for any budget, really. So I really want to go back and explore some more.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to start to wrap this up as we've gone over the hour mark at this point, and one of us on this call, has to actually edit this thing and get it out. If we get to some of our wrap-up questions, you're standing in the prettiest spot in Armenia. Where are you standing and what are you looking at?
I think I'm driving on that Voratan Valley drive along a winding road. I just found a place to pull over, and I see the misty mountains in the distance with a glimpse of a monastery and a valley. And hopefully, that could be said in anywhere, a lot of places in Armenia, but if you could get a glimpse of Ararat in the background, that's even an added bonus.
Excellent. One thing that makes you laugh and say only in Armenia.
Probably the little public water fountains everywhere. They just have these bubbling, they're just constantly bubbling up everywhere, and it's potable water, and it's actually funny but also very convenient. I did not even have to bring a bottle of water with me in almost even some of the small towns.
Interesting. And if you had to summarize Armenia in just 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
Monasteries, mountains, and coffee. I know we didn't talk about it, but coffee was ubiquitous. Little coffee vending machines, coffee
like
shops.
Like a Turkish coffee, a real
kinds.
rich coffee, all kinds. Okay.
Yeah, you could get you would never want to call it Turkish coffee there.
No.
But it was a strong stuff with the grounds at the bottom. There were little vending machines for the equivalent of a quarter. You could get a to-go small cup of coffee, just plain coffee. There was also lots of modern coffee shops of all sorts of types. And in the markets, there were coffee beans, piles of different kinds of coffee beans for sale. So you see it everywhere you go.
Interesting. I did not know that. Excellent. Our guest again, has been John Mackenzie. We mentioned that John's Instagram is John the Curious Traveler. And if we go to johnthetraveler.com, are we going to find a write-up yet about your road trip in Armenia?
I hope so. I am working on it still. There's a lot of detail I want to get put up there, but hopefully by the time this comes out or shortly thereafter, I'll have some information for people to check out.
So John and I will race to see if I can finish the podcast before he finishes the article. Either way, as soon as he sends that to me, I'll add that to the show notes of the episode. John, thanks so much for coming on Amateur Traveler and sharing with us your obvious love for Armenia.
You're welcome. It was great to be here.
Thanks to the patrons of the show who support the Amateur Traveler for as little as $5 a month. They get an earlier version of the show, also ad-free, and then a monthly Zoom call. If you're interested in learning how to become a patron of the show, go to patreon.com/amateurtraveler. And with that, we're going to end this episode of Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. And thanks so much for listening.